8 years ago today, Hillary Clinton went all in on the Trump Russia hoax. There's a whole series of tweets that she sent, again, 8 years ago today, Halloween Day 2016. And in every one of those tweets, she pushes this Trump Russia connection. There were Trump Russia links. What is up with Trump Russia? It feels like it was kind of a last desperate attempt. Maybe their internal numbers weren't looking so good. Whatever it was, it's very noticeable. And what a great occasion here today, 8 years on, to talk about not only that, but also I think equally as importantly, that no one's been held to account. All those tweets are still up. It's all still up. And the overarching point is this was her hoax. She orchestrated the hoax. What she says in those tweets, where she accuses Trump of Russia collusion, well, those were her own operatives.
Well, yeah, first of all, you were the one, you caught that, but we were offline and you were mentioning, do you know what today is? And I didn't, but of course you're right. It's the infamous anniversary. But I think the maybe the starting larger point is just to remind everybody of what happened here, is that the FBI was targeting the Trump campaign. And John Brennan, the CIA director, became aware through one of his own operatives in the CIA that the Clinton campaign had a plan to tarnish Trump with the allegations of Russia collusion. And what does John Brennan do? He takes it into Obama. Comey's there as well, lets him know. And rather than, what happens from there is what's so telling. That to me kind of defines the reaction of the Obama administration and their complicity. Because rather than do what you would naturally think, like, hey, maybe we should open an investigation into the Clinton campaign, they continue, and 2 days, 3 days later, they open up their formal investigation into the Trump campaign. That had to be with Obama's blessing. And, from there, John Brennan sets out. He goes out and meets one-on-one with every member of Congress. They continue on, ultimately produce the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, all of which is tarnishing Trump. So, the way I looked at it is not only was it the Clinton plan, but the Clinton plan became in part the Obama plan, is that his administration took that in and amplified it and breathed life into it. And as you said, today is the day when those Alpha Bank allegations finally came out. And what does Clinton do? She jumps out immediately with a ready-to-go, ready-made tweet by none other than Jake Sullivan, harping on, I think it was out, it was issued once the story, there's a story that broke, 3 of them actually, on this day. But once the first story broke, I think she had her tweet out in a matter of literally just minutes, all prepared, all ready to go. And as you said, going all in on the hoax.
And Jake Sullivan, of course, plays a very interesting part here. And we already mentioned that no one's been held to account. I mean, she got away with it, and everyone else got away with it. Okay, you might say, well, at least she then, a few days after this kind of barrage of tweets about Trump Russia, she lost the election. So great, she got her reward, her karma. But of course, Jake Sullivan went on to higher and more powerful places. He became a national security advisor, which to me, I still find just incredible that guy would have that role. We're not going to talk about him today. We could go through, it's a lot to talk about there, how he was bamboozled by the Chinese straight after he came in 2021 and so on and so forth. Maybe we can talk about that some other time. But the reason why he's kind of really important in this context is something, we've wondered about a lot. You mentioned that, of course, in July of 2016, Obama, Brennan, Clapper, so basically the Obama intel people, as well as Obama himself, found out about this hoax. They found out that Clinton had orchestrated this hoax. And as you said, they covered it up, and instead of investigating Clinton, they investigated Trump. By the way, I always thought that when Brennan briefed Obama on this on July 28th, 2016, we don't know what was said in the Oval Office, but I can almost imagine them actually colluding to the point where they were like, well, let's make this go away and let's investigate Trump instead. Because, of course, it was 3 days after this that they formally started the Trump investigation. But here's where it ties in with Jake Sullivan. The only reason why we know about this Obama Brennan briefing is because many, many years later, a little snippet was uncovered by the then Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe. This was kind of in the final months of the first Trump term. And that little snippet said that Russian intel had picked up the fact that Hillary had this plan, this hoax to tar Trump, to smear Trump with Russia collusion. And it said that it specifically talked about her foreign policy advisor. Now, if you, that's the person who either somehow they found he might have talked to someone and they found out, or he was somehow involved. That's what's in that little snippet. It doesn't mention a name, but of course, when you go and look at who was in charge of foreign policy advice in the Clinton campaign, well,
yeah, that was Sullivan. The easy one to put together.
Yep.
I was actually looking, and I can't find it at the moment, but there was a whole infographic that we did on this that was kind of the evolution of the FISA and all this coming through. And part of what it discussed was the timing of this information coming from the CIA and into Brennan. You know, but it's also interesting. Well, first of all, even though we won't go into it, it is notable. So here you have Jake Sullivan, who does what he does for Clinton, and he's elevated. And that's a very eerie parallel to what Anthony Blinken did when he basically set in chain the 51 former intelligence officials, say, well, now he's our Secretary of State. So none of these people are punished. They just are elevated upwards for their actions in helping to cover things up. John Brennan has never been punished. I don't think there was talk about him having his security clearances revoked, but that never happened as far as I can tell. You know, he's still out there to this day. It's really incredible. But I also found, Hans, I'm curious what you think, but I found today to be very, very telling, because there was the Franklin Feuer article, which disclosed the Alpha Bank, but there was also the New York Times article, and there was also an article by David Corn of Mother Jones. And the New York Times article was actually a delayed article, and it relayed to the same information about Alpha Bank that was being pushed by Perkins Coie lawyer Michael Sussman. And the New York Times had been asked by the FBI to delay their reporting, which they actually did, sat on it. And by the time they finally published their updated article in 1031, they came out and basically said, there's no here, and gave rationale for that. But that was completely subsumed. Amazing that the New York Times gets pushed to the side, but they did. They got pushed to the side by Franklin Feuer's article, which raised these ridiculous allegations about Alpha Bank and the Trump server, etc. But David Corn also issued his article that day. And in that article, not only he talked about Alpha Bank, but it was the first public reporting on the existence named of the Steele dossier. All of that hit on 10/31/2016. You know, really an amazing confluence of events. And of course, despite the New York Times saying, hey, there's nothing to see here, we were asked to sit on this story's, you know, they basically called bullshit on it. Despite that,
yep, they did.
Everything got, you know, because Hillary immediately tweeted Franklin Feuer's story along with Jake Sullivan's statement, boom, that was everywhere, off to the races.
It seems kind of weird, doesn't it, how a week out from the election, there was this massive effort all of a sudden. It's as if, I think I mentioned this at the outset, it's as if they kind of knew, well, maybe this thing isn't in the bag, which of course at the time everyone, and certainly in the media, just assumed to be the case, which might also account for the fact that the media didn't run with it, or maybe the media used to have slightly higher standards. I mean, who knows? We do know from emails uncovered in the Alpha Bank case. So Alpha Bank were the ones who were accused in one of the tweets, Alpha Bank is accused of having this secret server that allowed Trump and Putin to communicate. The whole thing is a total fabrication.
It sounds silly to say out loud now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just, yeah, incredible. And so she talks about, but there's actually another tweet where she talks about computer scientists have uncovered these connections. Well, these were her own people. These were her own campaign operatives. So I always thought the fact that they went all in on October 31st, 2016 meant that maybe they weren't quite as sure. Now, in terms of what we know about what was going on in the background with all these other media outlets, we found out from the Alpha Bank case. So Alpha Bank ended up suing Fusion GPS, who were the kind of the organizers of this. They were Clinton campaign operatives. And through discovery, we got all these emails. And in those emails, you can see how the Clinton campaign and its operatives are really pushing Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. They're pushing all of them. Do the Alpha Bank story, really pushing hard. And as I said, maybe they had higher standards. Maybe they thought, well, we don't need to do that because she's going to win anyway, but they didn't do it. And the one guy who did do it was Franklin Foer in Slate magazine. So by the way, that whole story, I talk about that in my book, Swiftboating America, how that came about, and also how Foer's main source, the guy who told Foer, oh, this guy is a guy called Paul Vixie, an actual computer expert. He told Vixie, no, this is all real. But then privately, he said the exact opposite. Anyway, total hoax. And of course, again, the fact that what's so kind of stark, what just hits you in the face here when you look at her tweets from 8 years ago, is the brazenness of the lies. It's not only, oh, I heard that somewhere, so I'm just going to put it out or whatever. She made it up. She talks about computer scientists, but they are her own operatives. It's just so extremely, completely brazen. And yeah, no one's been held to account, problem number one. But problem number two is, I think a lot of people don't even know about this. Certainly not the other 50% of the public. They don't even know that this happened. They don't even know how brazen these lies are, which of course, if they did, maybe then they start thinking about, well, what else are they lying about? Everything.
One thing that you said that struck me that I thought was so interesting was the idea that on 1031, Clinton must have, kind of had a foreshadowing. And what I immediately thought of was always the moment for me when I think the true insiders knew there was a major problem. And that was Ben Witz over at Lawfare, Brookings Fellow, et cetera, et cetera. And it was October 24th. And he sent out that article, Coalition of All Democratic Forces. And basically that was a call to arms. And that's where he said, I know everybody thinks that Clinton's going to win this easily, but just what if Trump actually wins the election? If he does, we need to be prepared to see him in court. And that was kind of the genesis of the lawfare against Trump. It's clear, reading that article with hindsight, that Witz was very aware, that Trump was almost certainly going to win the election, that he probably thought Clinton's chances were very, very poor. And, that was the beginning of setting up the lawfare attacks on Trump that would plague him, frankly, to this day. So, right on the heels of that, you have the three articles all hit on 1031. You have the tweet from Clinton, which again, as you rightly say, is so disgusting because she knows everything, literally propagating a lie that she created. It shows the desperation of her camp. So I think, your point about that was maybe one of the first public chinks is really well taken. It was that last week in October when they all realized, wow, we're in deep trouble, and this is going to go differently than everybody thinks.
And Brad Parscale, who was in charge of Trump's kind of online strategy back in 2016, he later became campaign manager in 2020, and then things didn't go so well. He told that whole story about knowing in advance, and I think he should have just kept quiet, but it is what it is. So after the election was won, after Trump won, Brad Parscale went out there basically bragging about the fact that they had developed this new strategy of micro-targeting people with ads in the swing states, especially in the Rust Belt, and involving, for instance, Facebook, where you can tailor the ads to the exact audience. Like you got a young male who doesn't usually vote, or whatever, and you can do that. So he said by doing that, and by looking at the data that all the data points that he had from that, the Trump campaign knew they were in very, very good shape, and the timing more or less coincides. So I always wondered if on the Clinton side they might not have appreciated this micro-targeting and how it all worked and so on, but whether they didn't have some similar kind of data points that led them to that. Now, I don't mean to digress too much here, but Pascal should not have said anything, because when he said that, remember, there was this huge outcry about, oh, Facebook, they're the ones responsible for Clinton's loss. And then, of course, Mark Zuckerberg had to try and wash his hands and pretend to, well, he didn't do anything wrong. I mean, it was just completely normal ad buys and stuff. But, you know, he had to go and cower. And then, of course, in 2020, he tried to flip the whole script successfully, in fact, the other way. But anyway, I didn't want to digress. But it all, yeah, I think around this time, so about a week out from the election, 8 years ago, the Clinton people knew they were in trouble. So then they threw this whole Russia, they just threw everything. And I think just imagine what it would be like now, not only in terms of the media having, you know, slightly higher standards, but can you imagine that you had all these things now, like Steele dossier? It's often forgotten that the Steele dossier was not a campaign topic in 2016.
Right.
That only started after Trump won, because they wanted to get rid of him. A lot of these, all this Trump Russia stuff was kind of on the periphery. You know, there were a couple of tweets in September from the Clinton campaign. No one really picked it up. You had Isikoff, you know, another of these their favored reporters. He put out a story on Carter Page, also in September. You had Nakashima, Washington Post. She put out a few stories, August, September. So there was a little sort of low burn fire, but there wasn't this all out Trump Russia. And you know, again, 8 years ago today, that's when they went all in with that.
Yep. I always thought there was also Julie Ioffi's article. I can't remember if it was in Politico or.
Right.
And actually, what I thought, it was a very good article. It gave away a lot of information, but she was reasonably okay about it. One of the things she said is that she keeps being given information from this shadowy operative group associated with the Clintons, which was clearly Fusion GPS. And she was viewing this stuff with a jaded eye, as were most journalists. But you're exactly right. I mean, again, you know, it was David Corn's article that first disclosed the existence of the Steele dossier on October 31st, and it still didn't gain any traction until 2017, and it's easy to lose sight of that. There was whispers, but that's really all it was. And at the same time, you know, part of this effort was that Steele was kept trying to push. He and Steele and Fusion GPS were trying to push the dossier into the FBI by a number of different points. You know, they ended up using, you know, the head of the legal at FBI as one of those means to do that. David Corn later gave fresh dossier documents from Steele to the FBI. So it was all an effort to get it in and get it publicized, and it's easy to forget that.
There's another one as well we haven't talked about yet. It's astonishing. I'd almost forgotten about this. If you look at all the stuff that happened on October 31st, 2016, there's no way all of that was just a coincidence. The other one I'm thinking about is Catherine Belton, the Financial Times. Her hit piece on Trump-Russia collusion, and the core of that hit piece was, of course, a poor innocent guy called Sergei Milyan, who had nothing to do with anything. And suddenly he was kind of painted as the bogeyman, and the connection, and that brought Putin and Trump together, and it's all him. And of course, the fact that it ran into Financial Times, which used to be you know, a paper of record and very much respected and so on, should have had a big impact. But as you say, it at the time it did not. That impact only came after Clinton lost. But yeah, no, she's another one. By the way, she's a good friend of Christopher Steele's, which of course she doesn't disclose in the article. I think the article formally came out on November 1st, but that was London time. So anyway, it would have been in the evening on October 31st. But you know, we have another one that fits in that category, and there's probably a few others that we're forgetting here if we kind of look back, if we did a search for all the articles on October 31st. But anyway, you got a bunch of articles, you got all the tweets, and it's all on the same day, and it's 1 week out from the election.
Yeah, and Luke Harding working in the background as well, another UK journalist who was very close to Steele. David Corn, I think, for his article, I think he was in the UK, if I remember correctly, meeting with both Steele and another friendly journalist who was friends with Steele. So, you know, it's all this circular pattern to bring this stuff forward. I don't know about you, but as a little bit of an aside, I've been enjoying watching Jake Tapper get shredded lately. You know, he's he ran that article on July 11th where he was milking the Steele dossier, and he was pissed because maybe it was the 12th. And he was upset because BuzzFeed had just published the Steele dossier. I think they intended to milk it for all it's worth. But what Jake never wants to talk about is the fact that Clapper either gave it to him or, at bare minimum, discussed the dossier with him. And James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, he tried to evade that, but under pressure from a congressional committee, admitted that sure enough, in the first week of January, he was talking to CNN and specifically Jake Tapper about the dossier. So, it's this ongoing evolution combined with the intelligence community assessment to take what wasn't really used in 2016. Well, it was used to get the Carter Page FISA, but it transitioned into becoming, kind of I guess in a way you could argue it was the foundation to write the ICA and then turn the whole Russia collusion narrative on full blast throughout 2017.
I was never able to figure out, and maybe we'll never know. I write about this in the book in terms of whether the Steele dossier, the inclusion of the Steele dossier in the ICA, in the intelligence community assessment, I think that was a given. But whether the fact that it was included in an annex was done on purpose, or whether it just turned out to be a very lucky circumstance. And here's why that question arises. Jake Tapper used the fact that the Steele dossier was in an annex to enhance the meaning of it all. So when he broke the story, he was the first to write about the Steele dossier, because again, no one touched it beforehand because no one could corroborate anything. And the guy worked, by the way, they knew that the guy worked for Clinton. That's something else that's never talked about. Fusion GPS paraded Christopher Steele in Washington, D.C. I write this about this in the book as well. They paraded him in front of a bunch of journalists. They had these. They booked a big room at the Tabard Inn, that's a hotel in Washington, D.C., and paraded him. They then brought him to the Washington Post, got a private meeting. They brought him into the Washington Post, said, "Oh, here's our man." All these people, all these so-called journalists knew that this guy worked for Clinton, and yet no one. Not one of them, and we're talking about basically the entire row of, a series of newspapers. All of them were informed of that. New York Times, Washington Post, all of them. Not one of them ever disclosed that fact. You know how it was actually denied? Oh, he's just some guy, And it took Devin Nunes like a year later through some financial transactions to disclose that Steele actually worked for Clinton. So anyway, coming back to Tapper. Why I have my question, I'll ask it to you because I don't know the answer. I'll ask you here in a moment. So the Steele dossier was included in the annex of the ICA. Now, the official story is that it was included in the annex because it was uncorroborated. That's what the IC people will tell you. But it turned out to be extremely fortunate for the media that is what happened, because Tapper, who was the first one to run this story, said it was in the annex because it was so super important. It was so highly sensitive. It was so it was the biggest thing ever. So you couldn't have it in the main part. And so you have a complete contrast here between the IC saying, no, we put it in the annex because it's not important. And Tapper is saying, no, it's in the annex because it's super important.
It is important.
I never figured out whether that was a coincidence or not.
My take on that was always that the IC knows exactly what they're doing. And, again, we have to have as a backdrop to this that it was James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, who briefed, Jake Tapper on the dossier itself. That's in the congressional, notes and in a deposition testimony. So my opinion is that they knew exactly what they were doing and that it could be treated as exactly such. I wouldn't be surprised to find out, we don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out if that's not exactly how it was presented to Tapper from Clapper. That this is in a super secret annex and he's able to go out with it like that. That would be my best guess as to things. I
certainly agree with the idea that Tapper on his own is probably not going to come up with such a super smart narrative. You're right. Whoever leaked it to him, and I I don't think it was Clapper. I can't prove it, but I think it was Comey. I think Comey imagined himself to be a kind of a Mark Felt, the original Deep Throat. You remember how it's Bernstein is on the byline there? Bernstein didn't write the article, but they have his name on there.
They wanted his name, right?
Yeah. So anyway, we hopefully will. This is one of the things we should also actually we should talk about that too. You know, all the things that are still outstanding, all the things we still need to find out. So the leak to CNN on this is one of the things we absolutely still need to find out. So whether it was Clapper, whether it was Comey, whether it was to Bernstein, whether it was to Tapper. But I do agree with you. You know, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense that this narrative that it's in the annex because it's so super, super important, it must have come from the IC. It's not something that Tapper thought of himself.
Yeah, and it is entirely possible, maybe likely, that Tapper got the physical dossier from Comey. And it's interesting that the FBI was the one, I believe, that was insistent that the dossier or the summation of it be attached as an annex. But again, we do know factually that Clapper discussed the document with Tapper. So it may well have been a twofold attempt where Clapper discusses the dossier with Tapper, and maybe Comey is the one that actually physically gets it over to Tapper. And again, as we, the FBI was the one that was insisting that it be attached. And, boy, I think if everybody kind of goes back to that moment to remember what kind of unholy fireworks were unleashed with BuzzFeed's publishing and with Tapper's story at that same time. It was just chaos.
And it was. And as you already alluded to earlier, we found out later that Tapper was extremely upset with BuzzFeed because he complained to them. He said, you're making the impact go away. What Tapper wanted to do is he wanted to do a drip of dossier stories for the next, however many months.
Yep. And
then BuzzFeed kind of got in the way of that and put out the whole thing, which at that point, to be honest, I would have expected anyone. And I remember myself. I was not involved with Russiagate or any of this kind of stuff. I was just I was doing legal work. I had no connection with any of these things. I was just kind of following it on the periphery. But I do remember that day because there was this thing that they'd always talked about in innuendo. By they, I mean the media, like on Twitter. I wasn't really on Twitter, but I think I had my account already. I wasn't there much, but once in a while you'd see something like, there's this story about Trump going around, but no one's willing to say, that thing. And then finally, in January of 2017, there it was. So I remember I was like, oh, okay, what is this? And I clicked on it, and without exaggeration, 2 minutes, no more. And I was like, yeah, sorry, this is a total hoax. It was so obvious. On page one, it says Trump hated Michelle Obama. It's just like this kind of childish. It didn't look serious in any way whatsoever. There were misspellings. Everything was just a total mess. Everything seemed so contrived. And I thought, oh, what a joke. And then just kind of, I would have never thought it would take off. And I guess that Tapper thought the same, that most people would react like I did. And that therefore his strategy was, no, we'll just release this one little paragraph. And then a week later, we'll release another one. So you never get to see the whole thing. And then hopefully this charade gets kept going. But boy, how wrong I was. It didn't matter that the whole thing was out. By people, especially the media, still, as you said, it just set off giant fireworks, which lasted for, 3-4 years?
Yeah, and you're exactly right about the quality of the dossier. Like, when I first read that, I remember thinking to myself, like, this is insane. This is absolute fiction, or our intelligence services are so much worse than I thought they were. The quality of it was like a school child. But I kind of always thought, Elon talks about the mind virus, right? And I always kind of felt like that was the moment that it really propagated. Because in a rational, logical world, people would have read the dossier just as Tapper was afraid they would do, and they would have just looked at it and thought, this is insane, just dismiss it. And instead, it just unleashed this incredible fiction that continues to this day, where there's still so many people that believe that Trump is a puppet of Putin and that the Steele dossier is correct, even though it's been entirely disproved. We've talked many times about Steele's, fictitious subsources, et cetera, et cetera. But it was just embraced wholeheartedly. And the intelligence community, I hate to say it, but they did a great job with this, the way they dribbled it out and the way they targeted Congress, where Brennan went to the Gang of Eight back in August 16, September 16, over a 2-week period. And then Comey waits, and then Comey goes to Congress right in probably the beginning of March before his testimony. And they just really planted this thing and set the hook.
Yeah. Maybe to close this out, we could talk about a few of the things that, should have happened 8 years ago, because again, the whole reason why we're talking about it today is that 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton just put out all these tweets alleging Trump-Russia collusion without mentioning that she was behind it all. She had orchestrated the whole thing. And of course, she should have been held to account. And now we may, in a few days' time, get another chance for that. That would be fantastic. 8 years late, but it would be great if we could still do that. So I think it would be a good idea just to briefly run through a few things that should be looked at. So I think obviously we're talking about the CNN leak here. I think that needs to be looked at. Where did that come from? The earlier Washington Post leaks, that again is something that needs to be looked at. Probably my biggest one is the DNC hack. Again, we never found out who hacked the DNC, only that the whole Russia story is full of holes and it's very, very unlikely that it was Russian government actors who did it. We talked about the Clinton plan, the July 28th, that Brennan told Obama about that. Well, how did Brennan find out about it? But more importantly, what Obama's never been asked about it. He's never been held to account. Why didn't he put an end to it then and there, since he knew at that point that this whole Russia collusion thing was a Clinton hoax? So I think there's still a whole bunch of stuff on the table, and I'd love to see the answers come out in the next 4 years here.
There's a couple of big ones for me. One of the things I'd like to see is I'd like to see whatever is written in terms of Brennan's briefing to Obama. But I'd also like to see the individual briefings that Brennan gave to the Gang of Eight members, because he didn't give them to them as a group. He went to them individually. And it's very clear that he gave differing briefings to the different members based on, we had a couple letters that were sent out to Comey that was basically from, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. He's now a deceased member of Congress, Democrat. I can't believe I can't think of the name. But he got a briefing and issued 2 different letters that were sent to
Harry
Comey.
Reid, yeah.
Yeah, Harry Reid, and demanding that that Comey make these documents public. So clearly Brennan was using Reid as a means to get this stuff out into the public sphere. Whereas you have other members like Devin Nunes was on that. He didn't know about that sort of element. So I'd love to see the differing briefings that were given by Brennan. But then the bigger picture is the one that you mentioned, is the fact that Obama has somehow miraculously skated through all of this, more or less clean. You and I certainly don't think that, but in terms of the broader public perception, his hands are very much involved with this. And I've always argued that there's a very real possibility that the Russia collusion narrative was really created as much as a means to cover up for what Biden was doing in Ukraine at the time, but the fact that could implicate Obama's knowledge of that they needed to shift that, and that it's entirely possible that was sort of the real genesis, if you will. I think we need to get more exposure on whatever Obama did, because he was involved. He could, even if there was nothing else, even if he only got the singular briefing from Brennan, he could then see what Brennan was doing. And there's no way Brennan's going to act on his own. That had to have Obama's blessing. So I would love to see greater exposure surrounding all of that.